Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be deep diving into the mind of one of the most feared, most terrifying, and most blood-curdling villains of all time, Hannibal Lecter. Growing up in Lithuania, Lecter watched his sister being cooked into a soup by war criminals, following which he turned mute for years. And when he revived, he was fueled by a sense of revenge. Hannibal grew up to be a renowned psychiatrist and established himself as a prominent member of Baltimore's aristocratic society. But he was also moonlighting as a serial killer with a superiority complex who loved to devour human flesh and organs with fava beans and a nice chianti. So what turned Hannibal Lecter into such a sophisticated cannibal? Let's find out together in this video. Before we get too deep into things though, we do have a very quick request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
You know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a
The Hannibal Lecter franchise, movie and show adaptations. Hannibal Lecter was introduced to the literary world as a cannibalistic serial killer in Thomas Harris's 1981 crime thriller Red Dragon. Dr. Hannibal Lecter, spelled L-E-C-K-T-O-R, appeared in Flesh and Blood for the first time on screen in the 1986 movie adaptation of the book. The Michael Mann-directed movie, titled Manhunter, had veteran actor Brian Cox playing Hannibal, who was frequently consulted by the brilliant FBI agent Will Graham in order to catch other serial killers. The character of Hannibal Lecter was further explored in Red Dragon's sequel novel, The Silence of the Lambs, which came out in 1988. This too was adapted into a movie in '91, courtesy of director Jonathan Demme, and the movie famously marked Anthony Hopkins' first appearance as the flesh-eating murderer. In this storyline, the FBI agent in training Clarice Starling piqued Lecter's brains in an attempt to capture another serial killer on the loose. The Silence of the Lambs bagged 5 Academy Awards and to date features on many lists of the greatest movies of all time. We'll elaborate on the storyline a little later, but for now, let's take a look at Hannibal's next appearance, and that would be in 1999 when the character got an entire Thomas Harris book all to himself titled Hannibal. This too would be adapted into a movie in 2001, this time by director Ridley Scott, with Anthony Hopkins reprising his role as the enigmatic killer. This would be followed by another Red Dragon movie adaptation of the same name, starring Anthony Hopkins and helmed by Brett Ratner in 2002. In 2006, Thomas Harris wrote the novel Hannibal Rising, traveling back in time and exploring Lecter's childhood and what turned him into a cannibalistic serial killer. And what partially prompted him to write this book is that Dino De Laurentiis, who owned the rights to the Hannibal Lecter character on screen, wanted to explore Hannibal's origins with or without Harris's help. Harris also ended up writing the screenplay for the 2007 Hannibal Rising movie, which had Gaspar Ulliel in the role of the killer. Now, if you thought these were all the on-screen adaptations that this greatest villain of American cinema had, then hold your horses, because between 2013 and 2015, Mads Mikkelsen featured as Dr. Lecter in the NBC television series Hannibal, which further explored his relationship with Will Graham, the FBI agent who nabbed him, but with a more complicated approach. In the CBS television show Clarice, released in 2021, Hannibal Lecter was simply referenced in association with the FBI agent Clarice from the Silence of the Lambs novel and movie. So that was just a gist of this terrifying villain's terrific legacy. Now we can move on to how this character was born in Thomas Harris's mind. Literary creation, Thomas Harris's real-world inspiration and criminal case parallels. So, what really inspired Thomas Harris to create this human-killing, organ-eating forensic psychiatrist of a villain which terrified and mesmerized audiences like never before? Most likely, it was his interaction with a real-life criminal doctor in the 1960s. During his Baylor University days in Texas, Harris covered the crime beat for the Waco Tribune-Herald newspaper and also wrote for the American magazine Argosy. For an interview with the psychopathic killer Dykes Askew Simmons, a 23-year-old Harris traveled to the Nuevo Leon State Prison in Mexico. During his time in prison, Simmons, who was convicted for murdering 3 people, attempted to escape by bribing a prison guard. But Simmons was betrayed when the guard took his money and shot him in both calves, leaving him disfigured. When Harris visited Simmons, he was being treated by a brilliant prison doctor, referred to as Dr. Salazar by the author, to help protect his identity. Harris had an intriguing interview process with with Salazar, describing him as a man of elegance and impeccable manners who had a lot to say about the nature of torment and had a lot to ask about Simmons's victims. Harris eventually learned from a prison guard that Dr. Salazar was a murderer himself who had this special talent of parceling his victims into a small gift box. Years later, in the special edition for the 25th anniversary of The Silence of the Lambs, Harris wrote that he imagined Dr. Hannibal Lecter as a close colleague of Dr. Salazar, kind of revealing Dr. Salazar as the inspiration behind this chilling personality. Now, the real-life Hannibal Lecter, or Dr. Salazar, is believed to be the Mexican doctor Alfredo Bali, who belonged to a noble family. Alfredo Bali had in fact killed his colleague and lover, Castillo Rangel, by knocking him unconscious with a chloroform-soaked towel and dragging him to the bathroom to slit open his throat and draining out all the blood before chopping him up. It is believed that this Alfredo Bali is also responsible for several travelers going missing from the Mexican countryside in the 1950s. Bali was apparently the last person ever sentenced to death in Mexico. Interesting to note here that Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter and Alfredo Bali both come from affluent, noble backgrounds, have conversational finesse, impeccable manners, and sharp acumen. Anyways, Mexico didn't really execute any prisoners at that point in time, so Bali's death sentence got reduced to just 20 years in prison. After his prison time, Bali dedicated his free years to helping the elderly and died in 2009. Interestingly, Bali walked out of prison the same year as Harris published the Red Dragon novel, which featured Hannibal Lecter for the first time. Family trauma and war. The making of Lecter's psyche. Lineage. Now, this brings us to the origin of Hannibal Lecter, as explained by the character's creator in the prequel book Hannibal Rising, and also in director Peter Weber's 2007 movie adaptation. Lecter was born into a wealthy family in 1993, and he was the son of Count Lecter and Madame Simonetta Sforza. He grew up in the ancient Lecter Castle located in Vilnius, in Lithuania's countryside. He displayed a rare kind of polydactyly, as two of the fingers on his left hand were perfectly replicated. Hannibal had an interesting lineage and was the eighth in his family to bear the name of his forefather Hannibal, as Count Lecter was the descendant of the warlord named Hannibal the Grim, who had died in the early 1400s. Hannibal the Grim fought in the Polish-Lithuanian Teutonic War and won in the Battle of Grunwald in 1410 against the Teutonic Order. He used the prisoners as laborers to build the Lecter Castle within just 5 years. Hannibal's mother, Madame Simonetta, belonged to both the Sforza and Visconti families, who separately ruled Milan for over 2 centuries. Years later, while disguising himself as Dr. Fell, the curator of the Capponi Library in Florence, Hannibal extensively researched whether he was also a descendant of Giuliano Bevisange, a brutal and fearsome 12th century figure from Tuscany, with Bevisange apparently meaning blood drinker. From his fragmented family history, Hannibal also believed himself to be of Machiavellian descent, but somehow he could never discover solid bloodline connections. He was also a distant cousin of the 20th century Polish-French artist Balthus. The War. Lecter grew up receiving fine education under the mentorship of his father, Count Lecter. Within a few years, their family grew with the birth of Lecter's baby sister, Mischa. But in the winter of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, that is Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, turned the Baltic region into a war zone. Nazi military forces infiltrated the Lecter castle, forcing Hannibal and his parents to flee the location with Mischa and seek shelter in their old hunting cottage in the forest. They survived for 3 years, eating mostly animals. However, in the winter of 1944, when Soviet soldiers stopped by the cottage asking for water, the tank was spotted by German forces and bombed by a ground attack aircraft, a Nazi Stuka, killing Hannibal's parents, their helpers, and the Tudor, everyone except for Hannibal and Mischa. The young Lecters, who survived the bombing, were held captive by the Nazi collaborator Vladis Grutas, who plundered and looted the Lecter Lodge. Now, Grutas was a ruthless Lithuanian war criminal during World War II, which led his men to loot riches and resources across battlefields. The trauma of losing his parents and what happened next is what started shaping Hannibal's criminal psyche as a tormentor and subconsciously fueled his secret urge for cannibalism. Mischa's death. Grutas and his men decided to take shelter in the remains of the Lecter cottage, as the location was secluded and blocked off. They kept the children alive to present them as a front for when soldiers attacked the cottage. However, without much food supply, Grutas and his men soon began to starve and turned to the 2 young ones as a last resort, deciding which to go for first. Mischa Lecter was picked out for being chubby, and one of Grutas's men sang a Lithuanian lullaby while she was taken outside and chopped up by Grutas with an axe. Her flesh was boiled boiled in a stew and eaten by the men to survive the harsh winter. Later in the novels, it was hinted that Hannibal too was forced to eat his sister unknowingly, as Brutus described Hannibal as the boy who had dinner with him during the war. After the winter passed, the lodge was attacked by Russian soldiers, forcing Brutus and his men to flee. Somehow, Hannibal escaped with chains still attached to his neck. Lost and turned mute by shock and grief, Lecter walked through the forest with his father's binoculars and was eventually found by Soviet soldiers who took him to the Lecter castle, which was at that point operating as an orphanage for war children. 2 years later, when Hannibal turned 13, he was adopted by his uncle Robert Lecter and brought to France, where he received further education and was influenced by Japanese culture, all thanks to his aunt, Lady Murasaki, nursed him back to health and taught him to speak again. Lecter developed an instant fascination with Lady Murasaki and marked his first kill when a butcher was rude to her. After Uncle Robert died from a heart attack, Lecter moved to Paris with his aunt, where he graduated early and became the youngest person to be admitted to medical school, where he was mentored by Dr. Dumas. First act of conscious cannibalism, emergence of a killer. Like we said before, witnessing his sister's death and cannibalism by Brutus marked the beginning of his transformation into a vengeful killer. Later in the novels, Hannibal explained that Mischa's death stripped him of his faith in God and made him believe that there was no real justice in the world. His criminal streaks started showing during his orphan days, where even as a mute kid, he attacked and wounded those who bullied him and others. In fact, he used to call upon his memories of Brutus killing Mischa just so he could be angry enough to hurt the bullies. Hannibal's foray into cannibalism was triggered further by the death of his uncle, who suffered a heart attack during a confrontation with a local butcher, Momund, who hurled profanities at Lady Murasaki. Hannibal would kill Momund with a tanto and offered his head to Murasaki's samurai ancestor, Date Masamune, as the tanto had once belonged to him. What followed was his first conscious act of cannibalism, where he cut off Momund's cheeks and with tips from the house chef cooked them with mushrooms and relished the preparation. Somehow, Hannibal came under the suspicion of Inspector Pascal Popple, but he managed to fool a lie detector test, and even Lady Murasaki came to his rescue. Psychopathy and methods. Hannibal's ritualized murders. Beheading the butcher was just the first of Hannibal's many murders and cannibalistic acts. When he went back to Lithuania in 1951 to dig up his sister's remains in the forest and give her a proper burial, he discovered the dog tags of Brutus's men. He promised Mischa that he would avenge her death, and neither Inspector Popple or Lady Murasaki could convince him to do otherwise. When one of Brutus's men, Dortlik, who had sung the lullaby to Mischa, attacked Hannibal, he killed Dortlik in return and ate the flesh off his cheeks. Hannibal would eventually behead Dortlik by tying his head to a horse. When the news of Dortlik's death reached Brutus, he assigned Milko to kill or bribe Hannibal, but Hannibal killed Milko by drowning him in formaldehyde. After Lecter failed in his first attempt to kill Brutus at his home, Brutus had Murasaki kidnapped and confined on a houseboat. When Lecter tracked down Brutus, the confrontation revealed that Brutus had his men feed Lecter the broth containing Mischa's flesh during the war. In retaliation, Hannibal carved the initial M repeatedly on Brutus's chest and then burned him to ashes along with his boat. Before leaving France, Hannibal killed the final member of Brutus's group, Brents, with a cleaver. Hannibal was eventually arrested for the murders by Popple, but he was let go after a trial because of insufficient evidence and testimonies from Dr. Dumas and the police forensics labs where he had worked as a volunteer. In fact, Hannibal had become something of a hero in France for killing the Nazi collaborators. Mind you, Hannibal was still in his early days as a killer. He was a teenager by the time he finished off Brutus and his men, so these are pretty much the major kills by Hannibal Lecter from the Hannibal Rising storyline. In later years, when his killer personality had flourished completely and he was on a full-fledged murder spree, Hannibal mutilated and cannibalized several victims, as mentioned in the storylines of Red Dragon, The Silence of the Lambs, and Hannibal. In 1970s Baltimore, Hannibal, while practicing as a psychiatrist, killed his sixth victim, a bow hunter, and he had him displayed as a wound man on his laboratory pegboard, just as seen in medical journals. FBI profiler Will Graham noticed that the bow hunter had the same leg injuries as the wound man from the books, and that perhaps inspired Hannibal to kill this man and hang him up to replicate the wound man in real life. He also killed a certain Darcy Taylor and cannibalized the flesh from her back. One of the most chilling confessions of Hannibal Lecter is admitting to the cannibalism of a census taker to FBI trainee Clarice Starling. "I ate his liver with some fava beans and a big Amarone," he tells her in the novel. In the film, Silence of the Lambs, the makers have changed a big Amarone wine to a nice Chianti, which some say isn't an ideal pairing with, well, any kind of liver. Moving on, Hannibal was on the board of the Baltimore Philharmonic Orchestra when he killed his 9th victim, the flautist Benjamin Raspail, by piercing his heart with a stiletto because apparently his lack of talent affected the entire orchestra. Hannibal then cooked his thymus and pancreas and served it at dinner with his fellow musicians. Hannibal also killed Lieutenant Boyle of the Memphis Police Department by beating him to a pulp with a riot baton, then disemboweling him. Just like Boyle, Officer Pembry too was in charge of guarding Hannibal at the Memphis police custody. Hannibal killed Pembry by biting his face, spraying him with mace, and then skinned his face with a utility knife. After escaping from Baltimore, Hannibal killed Capone library curator Dr. Fell, buried him in concrete to steal the curator's identity. While living in Florence, Hannibal killed the pickpocket Noco by severing his femoral artery and making him bleed to death. Hannibal's next kill was Detective Rinaldo Pazzi, who figured out who Lecter was. Hannibal threw him off the Capone library window. Hannibal showed particular cruelty to Paul Krendler, a deputy assistant attorney general from the United States Justice Department, who was apparently Clarice's archenemy. Hannibal removed Krendler's cranium while he was still alive and then scooped out parts of his brain to saute with capers and lemon. In the book Hannibal, Lecter shares the meal cooked with Krendler's brain with Clarice, who finds it delicious, but in the movie, Clarice is appalled when Hannibal feeds Krendler parts of his own brain. In the movie Hannibal, Lecter murdered 2 couples at separate times and staged their bodies as recreations of Botticelli's Venus and Primavera paintings. Interestingly enough, not all of Hannibal's victims suffered extreme torment or pain before dying. Some fans theorize that's because torture releases certain hormones in the victim's body which would deteriorate the quality of the flesh. Relationships. Will Graham, Clarice Starling, Bedelia Du Maurier. Will Graham. Through the course of Thomas Harris's Hannibal novels, Lecter developed some complicated rapports with the likes of FBI agents Will Graham and Clarice Starling, but at different points in time. The Red Dragon movie begins with Will Graham, a brilliant FBI profiler, seeking Dr. Lecter's assistance in catching a cannibalistic serial killer, only to realize it's Dr. Lecter himself. He gets stabbed by Hannibal at his mansion and barely escapes the encounter by stabbing Hannibal back and becoming directly responsible for getting him captured. Hannibal tried to ruin Will again by almost killing his wife and son. Thus, both of Will's close encounters with Hannibal were marked by violence, and the two began sharing a feeling of mutual hatred. However, despite that, Hannibal enjoyed his sharp conversations with Will during his time at the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane when Will sought his help to track down another serial killer, the Tooth Fairy. In the books, after Hannibal's attacks, Will Graham sinks into depression and resorts to alcoholism, refusing visits from his friends and living in isolation in Florida. Lecter, however, continued to resent Will for capturing him and roped in the Tooth Fairy to attack Graham again. In the TV show Hannibal, starring Mads Mikkelsen in the titular role, Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham's complicated relationship was popularly termed as Hannagram by fans. When Will goes to investigate serial killers in Minnesota, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Lecter begins supervising his mental state. Lecter, who's secretly a serial killer and cannibal himself, is impressed by Will's ability to understand psychopathic killers and how they think and function. As Will's psychiatrist, Lecter tries to manipulate Will and turn him into a killer. Meanwhile, a palpable tension develops between the two, with some critics describing it as an abusive relationship. In an interview ahead of season 2 of the show, creator Brian Fuller said that Hannibal and Will are engaged in a game of seduction. In his words, Hannibal has been working very hard to seduce Will, and now it's up to Will to seduce Hannibal. Again, those are his words. Clarice Starling. In the books, it's a twisted relationship that FBI agent Clarice Starling and Lecter share. When Starling seeks Lecter's help in Baltimore, he denies her at first, but when the other inmates humiliate Starling, Lecter warms up towards her. As an agent in making, Starling has to offer disturbing details of her childhood for Lecter to help her in catching the serial killer Buffalo Bill. This is when Lecter learns about Starling being traumatized by the slaughtering of lambs at her uncle's house as a child. And later, when Starling manages to nab Buffalo Bill, Lecter congratulates her with a letter, asking if the lambs have stopped screaming. That's what gives the book, The Silence of the Lambs, its name. Several years after Lecter escapes, Starling is entrusted to track him down, and in her attempts to do so, she collaborates with a Lecter survivor named Verger, a vicious pedophile himself. Eventually, Starling attempts to save Lecter when Verger has him captured, and Verger is someone who breeds wild boars just so they can eat Lecter alive. When Starling gets injured in the shootout, Lecter secures her and treats her at a secret rented property. Owing to this fondness for Starling, Lecter also kidnaps her arch-enemy, Krendler. Together, they eat his brains with Krendler watching. Lecter even forces Starling to act as his dead sister Mischa, but Starling refuses and retains her own identity, and they eventually become lovers. However, in the storyline of the film Hannibal, Lecter doesn't try to brainwash Starling, a character brilliantly portrayed by Jodie Foster. Instead, Starling handcuffs herself to Lecter in order to capture him for the FBI, but instead of hurting her to escape, Lecter chops off his hand to flee. As we mentioned before, they don't even savor Krendler's brain together. Instead, Krendler feeds Hannibal's brain to Krendler himself. Bedelia Du Maurier. Brian Fuller's TV series Hannibal introduced a brand new non-book character, Bedelia Du Maurier, an enigmatic psychiatrist played by Gillian Anderson. In the TV show, Lecter is an FBI psychiatrist and Bedelia is not only his colleague but also his therapist. From the beginning, Bedelia suspects that Lecter is behind a human veil and shares only one part of his persona with her. When Bedelia retires, it's learned that one of her patients has died during a violent confrontation at her study, and interestingly, this patient, Neil Frank, was sent to her by Hannibal. Later, in the storyline, it's revealed that Hannibal manipulated Bedelia into becoming a killer, and she killed Neil Frank by inserting her forearm down his throat while he was already choking on his tongue. Bedelia, who develops a fondness for Hannibal, tells him that she can no longer be a psychiatrist. She even warns Will Graham to be careful of Hannibal, as Hannibal was his psychiatrist. She tells Hannibal to slow down as the FBI has started to suspect him, which kind of reveals that Bedelia was aware of Hannibal's cannibalistic and murderous nature. She eventually flees with Lecter to settle in Florence as a couple and becomes comfortable with his crimes. But when Graham tracks them down, Hannibal escapes and Bedelia injects herself with psychotropic drugs to give the impression that Hannibal was keeping her drugged all this time. Bedelia goes on to make a living by delivering lectures on Hannibal's psyche, but also constantly living fear of getting killed or worse, eaten by Hannibal. She appears again in the much talked about striking finale of Hannibal Season 3. In the post-credits scene, she's seen all dressed up for dinner and sitting at a table set for three with her severed leg prepared as the entree, kind of like an offering to what appears to be Hannibal. The scene ends with Bedelia picking up the dinner fork and hiding it on her lap. Later, in an interview, showrunner Brian Fuller revealed, without any explanation of when and how, that it was Hannibal who cooked the leg, suggesting the titular character is still alive by the end of Season 3. Forensic genius, psychiatry, and the superhuman monster trope. Hannibal Lecter may appear emotionally cold, but beneath that veil lies his most terrifying trait, the ability to smell fear in others and use that to his advantage. From Hannibal's attachment to Clarice, we know that this character is capable of empathy, and again, his love for tormenting others shows his pure evil nature. This contradiction between morality and sadism is what makes Hannibal one of the most interesting villains of all time. Hannibal is also extremely self-aware and refuses to believe that his killer persona was influenced by his traumatic experiences. As he told Clarice once, "Nothing happened to me, Officer Starling. I happened. Can't reduce me to a set of influences." Also, what separates him from other serial killers is that Hannibal never killed for sexual pleasure. In fact, he primarily killed to seek revenge or because he deemed his victims inferior to himself or as an act of service to society. He was obsessed with seeking revenge for his sister's murder and delivered brutal deaths to each of Brutus's men. During his days as a renowned psychiatrist, Hannibal attacked Mason Verger for being a ruthless pedophile, an act seen as a service to society. And then, Hannibal also killed the orchestra member for being an incompetent musician, again, rationalized as a service to society or by his own superiority complex. Also, his elaborate and sophisticated preparation of his victim's flesh would often elevate the otherwise inferior humans to superior forms of culinary art. Hannibal would often arrange his victims' corpses like recreations of famous paintings or historical incidents. And that's because, owing to his knowledge of arts and history, Hannibal would seek satisfaction in delivering poetic justice to his victims' creative ways. Hannibal drugged Mason Verger and forced him to cut the flesh of his face and feed it to the dogs. This very act somewhat mirrors the death of the biblical Jezebel, who was ravaged by dogs after being thrown out a window. The bow hunter was hung like a wound man, which seems to depict several battle injuries mirroring Hannibal's childhood trauma. The detective, Ronaldo Pazzi was found hanging and disemboweled, just like Hannibal's ancestor. It also reflected the death of Judas, whose guts spilled out after he betrayed Jesus. Then again, Hannibal killed the deer hunter following the Nordic ritualistic execution method of blood eagle. As we've already mentioned, Hannibal was a man of manners and was particularly triggered by the rude, describing rudeness as an unspeakably ugly vice. He convinced a fellow inmate to kill himself for flinging semen at Clarice Starling. Lecter's caregiver later told Starling that Hannibal would often eat the root. Literary lineage, Gothic horror, and European myth. Hannibal's refined manners, his education, his love for classical music, and fondness for art and gourmet meals makes him a cultivated aristocrat, and brings to mind the likes of Gothic villains like Count Dracula. Just like Hannibal, Dracula's old-world sophistication masked his predatory nature. If we were to talk about folklore, then Hannibal's apparent genteel manners and cannibalistic tendencies brings to mind tales of the ogre. One might say that cannibals like Lecter are modern-day renditions of the folklore man-eaters. Hannibal's magnetic and morally corrupt persona is also reminiscent of characters like Milton's Satan or Lord Byron's own anti-heroes, characters that wow and repulse the audience at the same time. Marvelous verdict. Hannibal Lecter's cultural legacy. Well, by now, it should be amply clear that Hannibal Lecter's murderous legacy extends far beyond Thomas Harris's books. This character, first introduced in 1981, has spawned an entire franchise comprised of movies and shows. He has rightfully become a terrifying pop culture icon through fandom, memes, and media interpretations. When it comes to cannibalistic villains, nothing is more impactful than the chilling image of Anthony Hopkins from The Silence of the Lambs, masked and hissing at FBI agents, and not to mention his catchphrase, fava beans and chianti, which is endlessly quoted by fans in the context of cannibalism. Further, the NBC show introduced Hannibal in a new light, kind of like a romantic anti-hero, through his relationships with Will Graham and Bedelia Du Maurier. Thus, Hannibal Lecter continues to remain one of the most terrifying villains of all time and a fascinating case study for modern cannibalism. Unfortunately, folks, that's all we've got for you today on Hannibal Lecter. Don't forget to let us know what you think of this character in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and stay tuned for all the latest pop culture buzz. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.